Okay, in this video, I'm going to show you how to interpret an individual study. Specifically, we'll be looking at a longitudinal study. So in a longitudinal study, they're taking multiple measures at different points in time. And as we've talked about in class, the longitudinal studies, they get some aspects of causality that can be helpful, such as establishing covariation and showing temporal precedence between your or the temporal sequencing of your X and your Y, but they can't rule out alternative explanations for the apparent relationship. So longitudinal study is better than a cross-sectional study, but it's not perfect in that it can't establish cause and effect either. But in any case, we're trying to find the best studies that we have to help us answer our research questions. So sometimes for some of you, a longitudinal study will be the best one, particularly if you are studying something that would be difficult to have an experiment. If you have experiments that are about your research question, I would go for that first. In any case, so we're returning to our job burnout question, and job burnout rather, would be difficult to experimentally manipulate. So therefore, a longitudinal study will be better for us. If we saw this study and we learned that this was the study we wanted to use by using similar search terms as before, except instead of having a meta-analysis, we instead start using search terms for a longitudinal study. Longitudinal, repeated measures, even just time in the title or abstract can help get you there. The first thing we want to do is make sure that the relevant Peacock terms are present. So importantly, at least the intervention and comparison, which is another way of saying the independent variable, which can be continuous. It doesn't have to be one intervention and one comparison, like two groups. Instead, it can be one variable that varies from low to high, as would be the case presently. So we would have these predictors of burnout being these kind of continuous variables as our intervention and comparison kind of category. Then outcome, the key outcome here for this running example is burnout. It's important to make sure that the terminology is similar. In this case, they're calling burnout job burnout. And so maybe they mean something different than just burnout, but I read the definition that they provide right in the first sentence, how lucky for us. And I see that they are defining burnout in the same way that it has been defined in other studies, this three-dimensional construct: exhaustion, depersonalization, and reduced sense of personal accomplishment. And they're using the same model as the meta-analysis that we looked at before. So that's nice, but now we're getting in this time ordering factor. So if we measure job demands and resources at one point in time, does that affect burnout at another point in time? Much of the rest of the article you can interpret very similarly to how you interpreted your meta-analyses. You don't have to, implement something more complicated here, although there may be parts of these types of studies that are a little bit more complicated to understand. You don't need to get hung up in the weeds there. Again, we'll read our definitions. We'll make sure that the definitions they provide are similar to what we have been looking at before. And again, they're looking at resources and engagement. We don't necessarily care about engagement as another outcome variable for this particular research question, which is what are the strongest predictors of burnout. They also have this additional factor here that maybe we would want to include. It's up to you. It's up to your discretion if you want to include something else. Just make sure it's it is something that answers your research question if you decide to include something new. And so here they're talking about not just your job demands and job resources, but you as a person. You have some sort of ability to successfully control your impact on your environment. Okay, great. Self-esteem, optimism. Okay. So something too you'll want to check are these hypotheses and see if the hypotheses match up closely to your research question. In this case, they're testing if job demands are related to burnout over time, and job resources are related to burnout over time. Here you see they start introducing this idea of a mediator. And you don't have to worry about mediators if you don't want to. If you want to get a little fancy with it and go and interpret a mediator, that's fine. Feel free to reach out to me. But by and large, we don't need to be concerned about a mediator. And even though they have a mediator and this is specifying a type of relationship with 3 variables, as we talked about in one of our earlier classes, we can still find an effect size between personal resources and job burnout, as we'll see. Okay. Another thing you want to think about is how you can tell what type of study this is. Perhaps I should have started there. This one's a little easier because it's in the title. Because there were so many studies on burnout, I could specify that I wanted this to be a longitudinal study in the title, and that's exactly what I found. If you don't have that many studies, you can still see what kind of study it is. Sometimes they'll say in the abstract, as we have here. In fact, most of the time they'll probably say in the abstract. But if not, then you should be able to identify the study by looking at the methods section. So here they're describing how their procedure, their participants and procedure, and they have these descriptions of how they're measuring things. At time 1, we gathered these data. At time 2, that's what these T means. We gathered these data. That's how you know it's a longitudinal study, that there's multiple points in time. If they just said it's a survey and it was all gathered at one point in time, that would be a cross-sectional survey that was taken with no time ordering, no different points of measurement. Another thing to consider is we actually kind of have a specific population here that is about Chinese companies. That may be something, or Chinese employees, that may be something that you would care about in your rapid evidence review. Maybe not. There's a different culture in China. Maybe you're interested in solving a problem for your organization in the United States, and that would matter for your research question. So you might exclude this paper for the fact that they have a different population of interest here. But for examples purposes, let's just continue with the interpretation part of it. Here you see how they're measuring everything, how they measure job resources. If that's part of your research question, like how can we assess burnout in job demands or what have you, then you might want to read this and find your citation that they used to measure burnout and backwards search. So find that original citation and examine how burnout can be assessed. But that's not part of our research question. So we're going to just keep going. And this is where it might get a little hairy if you start seeing words that are kind of like, what is confirmatory factor analysis? What is, as we'll see later, structural equation modeling? You actually really don't need to worry about that at all. All you need to do, again, is find this same table that we had essentially in the meta-analysis. Table 1, the glorious table 1 with your correlations among study variables. So these are all the correlations between all the variables. You're going to interpret it much of the same way as you did before, but this gives you a nice example of different ways that these correlation matrices, as they're called, can be portrayed. Here we see these time 1, time 2, time 3. If you look closely, you see that the variables are actually all the same, just at these different points in time. So they're just repeating them more or less. Some of them aren't measured on the last point in time. Then we need to figure out what all of these letters mean. Here we have job demands, job resources, personal resources, and job burnout. There should always be a note that explains these shorthand ways of describing the variables in the bottom. You also see how many people they got. N is the sample, 263. Okay, that sounds good. And you'll notice that as part of our interpretation, we need to get an effect size, and we need to determine if the effect size is practically significant and statistically significant. Those are the 2 primary pieces of information that we need. The statistical significance component of it we can see here that they explain all the correlations are statistically significant at p less than 0.05. Great. So we know that it is likely that these correlations are not due to chance and that they're due to a real effect, that they're statistically significantly different from zero. Now we need to figure out which of these correlations we want, which one is the most important to us. You could look at job burnout at multiple points in time and see which correlations are the most strongly related to all three different measures of burnout. I might actually start with the last measure as kind of like, okay, let's see how things progressed. And in terms of finding out which effects are most practically significant, that comes down to how big these correlations are. Are they a small, medium, or large correlation? What we do is similar to what we did before to interpret this, is we can see that if we look across, all of these correlations are different combinations of job burnout measured at time 3 and other variables that they measured. Because we already got a correlation between job burnout and these other factors at a single point in time in our meta-analyses, because the meta-analysis was not longitudinal, then I'm actually going to just exclude these time 3 variables, job demands, resources, and personal resources at time 3. And I'm just going to try to find these other variables here that were taken at time 2 and see which ones are most strongly related to job burnout at time 3. The numbers are how you can cross and find the right correlation. So 1 here at the top corresponds to 1 here over on the side. You notice there's no correlation between those two because it's a correlation between itself. So if we want to know how job demands at time 2 is correlated with job burnout at time 3, we need to find where job burnout, number 12, crosses with job demands, number 5. So we'll highlight here, we see 5 in this column, and we go down, and we see that job demands at time 2 is correlated with job burnout at time 3 at 0.33, a nice hearty medium effect. That's a decent effect size in the social sciences. Okay, great. So that aligns with what we would expect, and we have this temporal ordering such that we can see that job demands in the past are affecting burnout of right now, or whenever this was taken. Let's look at job resources, which is number 6. We do the same thing. We see number 6 over here, and we follow it all the way down to where it aligns with job burnout at time 3, negative 0.36, a medium effect in the opposite direction. As job resources increase, job burnout decreases at time 3. And let's look at personal resources, which is numbered 7, same thing. And we see a similar correlation, maybe slightly larger for job resources, indicating that the manager or other decision makers in the organization can implement something that would potentially be able to provide employees with resources that would help prevent burnout. But in addition to that, having employees who are resilient, having employees who have self-efficacy and a sense of ability to control their environment, that is a protective factor as well. Okay. So those pieces of information would be enough for you to answer your research question looking at an individual study. We can say that these are medium effects, they're statistically significant, and that job demands, not surprisingly, increases burnout at a later point in time. We could also, one thing that I think is kind of interesting about this is you can see how much job burnout is correlated kind of with itself at different points in time. So number 4 is job burnout at time 1, and number 8 is job burnout at time 2. Let's see if we wanted to see what the strongest predictor of burnout is at time 3. Burnout at time 2 of 0.41, that's the strongest predictor of burnout at a later point in time. And I bet we would see something similar if we did it again with burnout at time 2. So burnout at time 1 is number 4. And all the time 1 variables are 1 through 4. So we'll go from 4 over to see what most strongly predicts burnout at time 1. And we see that, in fact, yes, it's burnout at time 1 that is the strongest predictor of burnout at time 2. I mean, this makes perfect sense in that you're measuring the same variable over and over again. But what's relevant about this is it gives us a sense that burnout is a relatively stable state of being when you're measuring it over the period of time that these people measured it. So that would be a piece of information that you would want to look at. I think it's a couple of months here, maybe a year, if I remember correctly. So within a year's time frame, a lot of people reported pretty stable levels of burnout. It's not something that changes quickly day by day, like emotions, for example, which actually can change moment by moment. So if there is a problem with burnout, it's a long, slow burning one, right? If you'll excuse my my horrible, I don't know, pun, I guess. This is sort of interesting information in and of itself. So one of the strongest predictors of burnout is previous burnout. Why that is, we're not able to answer that here. It could be that some people are more prone to burnout, as maybe it's suggested by the personal resources aspect of this model, right? If somebody has just generally a stronger sense of self-efficacy, that maybe they're less prone to being burned out compared to other people. Or maybe it's that whatever factors are the job demands, job resources, that people aren't really experiencing a lot of changes in their work environment over the course of a year. And so why would their level of burnout change if the nature of the job itself hasn't changed that much? We can't answer any of these questions here. In part, they didn't ask those questions, and it's not a causal study. But in any case, it's still interesting that we see a level of stability with job burnout over time. And I want to show you one more thing before we end this video. Hello. Okay. You may see things that look like this. And for a longitudinal study, I would not worry that much about this. This is their model, the theoretical model that they were testing. As you can see, it's extremely complicated and it's pretty ugly, and there's just a lot going on here. These are essentially, they did structural equation modeling, which is sort of like a form of regression, more or less. And, you could look at this information if you wanted, but you don't need to. All you could do instead is find the correlation matrix, find your effect size. That's all you really need. So if you find things like this, don't get overwhelmed. You're again looking strategically for the information that's relevant for you. And you might want to, in fact, I encourage you to read the discussion section for your studies to see how they interpret the results. Some of them might not be relevant for you. You would want to align the hypothesis that is closest to your research question and read that part of the discussion section, but they will have some implications for what does this mean for managers? How can managers use this, or employees use this information? How would this help make the work context better for people? So that is longitudinal studies. And again, if you have any questions or anything, always feel free to reach out.